Welcome to my lesson on progressivism under Taft and Wilson. So, little review from the last lesson. We know that Roosevelt was the first of the three progressive presidents. Roosevelt did not run for re-election after his second term. Instead, his hand-picked replacement, William Howard Taft, ran on the Republican ticket and was elected president. So Taft was victorious. He won very easily because he was endorsed by President Theodore Roosevelt, who was very popular at the time. But Taft very quickly got on the wrong side of the progressives because he did not appoint progressives to his cabinet. Now, hopefully, we remember that the cabinet is comprised of the assistants to the president. They're referred to as secretaries, such as the Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of State. These are members of the presidential cabinet, and they're typically experts in their particular fields. Okay, so Taft, when he took office, pledged to continue Roosevelt's reforms, but he alienated many progressives, and he started off by not appointing them to or any progressives to his cabinet. So Taft ran on a goal that Roosevelt had not addressed, that is, lowering tariffs. So let's review tariffs briefly. Tariffs are a tax on imported goods. Okay? And the purpose of tariffs is A, to raise money for the federal government, but B, to protect items or industries that are producing items here in the United States. So that's what a tariff does. So Taft ran into some opposition in Congress when he wanted to lower these tariffs, and instead of sticking to his guns on tariffs, he signed a compromise bill, which had the bill was called the Payne-Aldrich Tariff Act, and the bill had some protectionist features which actually raised some tariffs on certain items, and this enraged the progressives who wanted tariffs lowered. The progressives felt that tariffs hurt the working poor because they could not afford to pay for the extra cost of items due to these tariffs. So progressives wanted tariffs lowered, if not eliminated, as much as possible. So here we have a picture of William Howard Taft. Little background on Taft. He was the heaviest president of the United States. I believe he was over 300 pounds. And he also is the only president to form or to serve as a member of the United States Supreme Court after he left office. He was appointed as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court by Warren G. Harding. And ironically, Taft really didn't want to be president. He actually wanted to be a Supreme Court justice, and he wound up fulfilling that dream later in life. Okay, so progressives felt betrayed by Taft as well on the management of public lands. So Taft's choice for Secretary of the Interior, remember when it says Secretary, that's a member of the cabinet, was Richard A. Ballinger. And this irritated conservationists who were progressive. Ballinger opposed conservation policies on federal lands in the West and sided with various business interests and sought the unrestricted development of Western lands. So Ballinger's views inevitably brought him into conflict with a man named Gifford Pinchot, the head of the U.S. Forest Service, who favored scientific management of wilderness lands to allow both preservation and development. And this was very much Roosevelt's view. Roosevelt understood that land could be used in a responsible way. So Roosevelt very much sought this balance between total conservation and also land development. So In 1909, it became common knowledge that Ballinger had allowed a private group of business people to obtain several million acres of Alaskan public land, which contained rich coal deposits. Pinchot, remember he's the head of the Forest Service, he charged he's charged that Ballinger had showed improper preference to this group of business people. Taft fired Pinchot after he protested and suggested corruption on the part of Ballinger to a congressional committee. So at this point, Taft has stood up for Ballinger and fired Pinchot. Ballinger, although it was never proven that he was involved in corrupt activities, he resigned anyway, and Pinchot emerged from the entire affair as a popular hero. So Pinchot's status was very much raised, while Taft's popularity was declining. So angry Republican progressives teamed up with Democrats in the House of Representatives to attack opponents of reforms. These were members of the Republican Party that were referred to as the Old Guard. And the Old Guard was very powerful because it controlled the House Rules Committee. And they used their control of the Rules Committee to block proposed reform legislation that was favored by the progressives. So the progressives figured out a way to get around this. They limited the power of the Old Guard Speaker, Joseph G. Cannon, by passing a resolution that allowed the full membership of the House, instead of the Speaker, to appoint the Rules Committee. So at this point, the Speaker is not appointing Old Guard members to the Rules Committee. Instead, progressives are being appointed by members of the full House of Representatives. So this led to a bitter split in the Republican Party between the Republican progressives and the Old Guard, who preferred the traditional Republican values before the era of Roosevelt. Roosevelt, when Taft was elected to office, went on a safari to Africa. Remember that Roosevelt was an avid outdoorsman, and when he returned to New York, he returned to a firestorm of protest against his successor, William Howard Taft. Roosevelt got involved in this battle between the progressives, whom Taft had alienated, and Taft himself. So Roosevelt went around the country campaigning on behalf of progressives during the midterm elections. Remember, midterm congressional elections is when the president is not running. It's on the year that the federal elections are in even years. It's the year the president is not on the ballot. So Roosevelt and his fellow progressives called for business regulation, welfare laws, workplace protection for women and children, income and inheritance taxes to prevent the wealthy from being able to pass incredible wealth on from generation to generation. And they also supported voting reform. Roosevelt called his ideas new nationalism. So the congressional elections brought down, the congressional elections of 1910 brought down the Old Guard. So progressive Democrats and Republicans were at this point firmly in charge of both houses of Congress. I told you guys earlier that Roosevelt, when he was elected to his second term, remember he took office after McKinley was assassinated. When he was elected to a second term, he promised he would not run again. He soon came to regret that decision when he saw just how unpopular Taft's policies were. And Roosevelt himself loved being president. Roosevelt was a very energetic guy. He drank about a gallon of coffee a day. He packed about as much living as you can into one lifetime. Roosevelt absolutely loved being president. So for the Republican nomination, the voters clearly preferred Roosevelt, yet the Republicans gave the nomination to William Howard Taft. And Taft accused Roosevelt of stealing the election from him. And he wound up joining a party called the Progressive Party, which would later on be nicknamed the Bull Moose Party, because of a comment Roosevelt made about how he was feeling, and he ran as what's called a third party candidate. He didn't run as a Republican or a Democrat. He ran as a member of a third party. So much of the Bull Moose platform mirrored that of your standard progressives, as is highlighted on this slideshow. And many of the ideas of the Progressive Party would actually become law. A lot of this stuff should look familiar as you read the slide. It's law and policy that we have today. So progressives had the support of women in states in which they were allowed to vote. Remember, this was before the passage of the 19th Amendment. This was before women were permitted to vote in federal elections in all states. They could vote in state elections, but they could not vote in federal elections until the passage of the 19th Amendment. But remember that election laws are up to individual states. So although there was not federal protection allowing women to vote, there were some states that they did in fact vote, but they just weren't allowed to vote nationally. Now, Roosevelt, as I told you, was a very energetic guy. He ran an aggressive and lively campaign. He was even once shot while giving a speech in Milwaukee, and he went on to speak for another hour and a half with a bullet lodged in him before he went to seek medical attention. Quite the interesting fellow, if you ask me. So meanwhile, Taft complained about his dislike for politics. Remember, Taft didn't really want to be president. He wanted to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And despite the criticisms he received from the progressive movement, he did in fact reach some progressive goals. He reserved more public lands. He brought more antitrust lawsuits in 4 years than Roosevelt had in 7. Remember, antitrust lawsuits is when the government used the Sherman Antitrust Act to try to break up trusts and monopolies. He supported the Children's Bureau and the 16th and 17th Amendments. You may recall there were 3 progressive amendments, the 16th, 17th, and 18th. Hopefully you remember what they were because you should have done an assignment on them. But despite his progressive achievements, he and the rest of the progressives remained at odds. So on the ticket from the Democratic Party was Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was an academic, and he was serving as governor of New Jersey. He was the governor of New Jersey, but he was a former president of Princeton University. So he was a very, very intellectual man. He was an academic. So Wilson, unlike Roosevelt, ran on a platform of reform. Remember, a platform is a candidate's basic ideas. But unlike Roosevelt, Wilson was critical of both big business and big government. Roosevelt called his platform New Nationalism, and Wilson called his New Freedom. Wilson promised to enforce antitrust laws without threatening competition and to protect consumers. These were pure progressive ideas. And here we have a picture of Woodrow Wilson, and he would eventually lead the United States into World War I. But we will talk about him later. At this point, I'm going to stop this slideshow and I will film part 2 of 18.3.